Reprise de débat. The honourable member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's indeed an honour for me to rise in my place and speak and contribute to the debate on Bill C-19, an act to amend the Criminal Code and the Firearms Act, also known as the Ending the Long Gun Registry Act. Mr. Speaker, several members on this side of the House have opened their interventions by talking about their personal history with respect to firearms, and I think I ought to do the same. I don't own any firearms. I can count on one hand the number of times I've used a firearm, and I can state for the record I don't really even like firearms. So for me, this is not an issue about firearms. This is an issue about liberty. It's about individual liberty, and it's an issue concerning the role of the state, and I would suggest the tendency over the last 2 or 3 decades of the state encroaching upon the rights of law-abiding citizens and the individual liberties of Canadians. So that is the perspective and the lens on which I assess the merits and the values of the long gun registry that was brought in the mid-1990s by a previous government, Mr. Speaker. Now, as a libertarian, I must concede that we compromise on our libertarian values every day of the week. For example, when I arrived here in Parliament Hill this morning in a motor vehicle, you have to respect certain rules of the road. You can only drive on the right-hand side. You have to observe speed limits and traffic control devices, both for your own individual safety and obviously for the safety of other pedestrians and other operators of vehicles. I accept that. So any law or any regulation or any registration or any registry to be valid and to be legitimate, I think has to pass 3 tests. And those tests, Mr. Speaker, are the following. It has to serve a valid purpose. It has to be effective in achieving that purpose. And thirdly, it has to do so in a cost-effective manner. And I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, and to the members of the House that the long gun registry fails on at least 2 out of those 3 tests. Is there a valid purpose? I suspect there actually is. The long gun registry, as you know, was implemented in response to a very, very tragic event at École Polytechnique in Montreal. It was a tragic, tragic incident, one of the black marks in Canadian history, and there was considerable political pressure to do something to protect women and protect citizens generally against the violence of firearms. So the government of the day's response, I think, was legitimate. I actually don't share the view of some of the members on this side of the House that the purpose of the bill was to criminalize hunters and farmers. I actually don't think that was the purpose. That's what happened, but I don't think that was the purpose. I think I'm going to give the former government the benefit of the doubt that it actually was a legitimate purpose, although not well thought out. So the second test is the registry or is the legislation effective in achieving that purpose? And I say unequivocally that it is not. And it was not from the beginning because it was not thought out properly. And the members of the House, such as the member from Prince George, who has been here since the infancy of the long gun registry, predicted back then, and they maintain to this day, that you cannot effectively control violence with guns by targeting lawful law-abiding gun owners. And that's consistent with any matter of policing, Mr. Speaker. I mean, I live in the city of Edmonton where there's been over 40 murders this year, incidentally not one by a long gun. The weapon of choice most frequently used in Edmonton when there are murders are knives, but that's a story for another day. But the police, of course, use their resources to police neighborhoods and parts of Edmonton where they know crime occurs with greater prevalence and where criminal elements are known to exist. They don't routinely and frequently patrol the neighborhoods where law-abiding citizens are known to exist. So when the authors of this registry decided that they were going to force legitimate gun owners, such as sportsmen, such as hunters, such as trappers, to register their weapons, they went after the wrong people. And it was, as was predicted and what should have been known and which was argued, if you check the debates on C-68, I think it was, It was known then and so now that criminals simply do not register their weapons. So the program was ill-conceived, it was ill thought out, and it in fact has not been effective in reducing crime. Mr. Speaker, as you may know, I serve on the Public Safety Committee. I served on the Public Safety Committee in the last Parliament when the Private Members Bill sponsored by the member for Portage-Lisgar was before our committee. And I had the opportunity of examining in some detail the then President of the Canadian Police Association, a Mr. Charles Mummy. And Mr. Mummy came to the committee to tell us that abolishing the long gun registry was going to be a huge mistake, that it was a critical tool in the arsenal of the police toolkit. But when pushed on that issue, he admitted to me that the police cannot and do not rely on the long gun registry. And I will tell you why he admitted that. When asked, when police respond to an incident and they do a long gun registry search, or they do a registry search, if it shows that there are no registered weapons at that residence, can they safely assume that there are no weapons? And the answer is, of course not. They have to go in hoping for the best, but being prepared for the worst. So they don't rely on it when it shows that there are no weapons registered at that residence. And I asked them a second hypothetical. What happens if their long gun registry search shows there are in fact 2 weapons at that residence? And you go in and you find 2 weapons and you take them out of play. Does that mean you now have a safe crime seat and you can assume there is not a 3rd or 4th weapon? And he answered, of course not. You always have to assume that there are additional hazards and additional perils at that scene, notwithstanding that the registry said there were 2 weapons and you found 2 weapons. So we got two examples, one where there was a negative result from a registry search and one where there was a positive result, and in neither circumstance did the police actually rely on the data. So we know that police do not and cannot rely on the long gun registry. We know that it does nothing to deter crime under the very, very simple premise that criminals do not register their weapons. So the third part of my test, Mr. Speaker, regarding whether or not there's an appropriate legislative or registration response to a problem is the cost effectiveness. And you will recall, Mr. Speaker, that the original estimate for Bill 68, the long gun registry, was $2 million. Now, that doesn't sound like a large sum of money to promote a legitimate goal, as I identified, which was to reduce violence against women, reduce gun violence generally. But as you know, Mr. Speaker, $2 million was a gross underestimate of the actual cost. And what, was the estimate out by a margin of 10 or a margin of 100? No, Mr. Speaker, it was out by a margin of 1,000. This long gun registry has cost taxpayers $2 billion. And it has done nothing and can do nothing to deter crime or prevent guns from falling into the hands of criminals. Police have told us, although chiefs of police like to say that they're in favor of the long gun registry, but when pushed to ask if they would, if in a world of finite resources, would they prefer more boots on the ground or would they prefer a long gun registry, they always answer they would prefer resources for something other than the long gun registry. So on that test, the long gun registry fails. It is not an effective response to a legitimate goal. It is not a cost-effective response to a legitimate goal. I am proud to stand up in this House and be a part of a Conservative government that is actually going to put an end to this train wreck from the beginning. And I think the liberty of individual law-abiding farmers, hunters, fishermen, trappers will be preserved. And I encourage all honourable members to vote in favour of Bill C-19. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question and commentaire, the honourable member for Halifax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my colleague for his intervention. I've seen him at work at committee, at Justice Committee, and he's always very factual and to the point. And I guess my question, I've heard many of his colleagues stand up today and say, I intend to keep my promise to abolish the registry. Over and over, I intend to keep my promise. And so my question to my honourable colleague is, What about the promise to actually do something about crime in our communities? What about the promise that the Conservatives made, I think it was in 2005, but I will stand corrected if I have the date wrong, in 2005 when they pledged, as part of their platform, that they would put 1,000 RCMP police officers on the ground, 2,500 municipal police officers on the ground. They had a whole campaign about boots on the ground. So what about the promise to actually do that and actually make our communities safer? This is not about keeping a promise, as we all know. This is about pure ideology, and I'd like to hear an answer from my colleague. Thank you.
The honourable member for Edmonton St. Albert.
I'd like to thank very much the question from the honourable member from Halifax. I always enjoy a good debate with her. She is always prepared and always comes bringing her A game. With respect to the question, I will keep my promise, and I promise to abolish the wasteful and ineffective long gun registry. And with respect to our other promise, with respect to are we going to do something to fight crime, perhaps the honourable member is familiar with a bill that's before the Justice Committee called C-10, which is a comprehensive piece of legislation that includes 9 pieces of legislation from the former Parliament, which we were not able to get through that minority Parliament, and it deals with a variety of minimum mandatory sentences for individuals that grow drugs and sell them to children and sell them near schoolyards, and deals with some sexual offences against children. It's a great bill, and I encourage you to support it.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for Edmonton St. Albert for his presentation. I even tweeted it because I haven't heard anyone in the House of Commons put out that as a libertarian at the beginning of a statement. I found that riveting. I'm looking for an answer about. I can see your. I appreciate the honourable member's enthusiasm. I'm baffled in this debate because whenever a member of the opposition says, look, the police chiefs of Canada voted unanimously that they find the long gun registry useful. And whenever anyone in the opposition says, look, the RCMP Commissioner, William Elliott, sent a report to the government, August 27th, 2010, in which he said their firearms registration is a critical component of our entire firearms program. And further, that report said it was cost-effective and efficient. And the response from government members tends to be that we've made these up, that they didn't really happen, but these reports stand. And I asked the honourable member to explain how it is that the institution of the RCMP and the institution of the Police Chiefs of Canada have supported the registry, and yet the government members say it isn't useful for them.
Honourable member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Well, I had the opportunity to examine Chief Blair on this very issue when he appeared before the Public Safety Committee on its examination of C-391, the private member's bill in the last Parliament. And no doubt Chief Blair does support the long gun registry and has his reasons for doing so. But I would submit to the honourable member that he does not speak for the entirety of the chiefs of police across Canada. He does speak for the association because he is the president. But the honourable member will no doubt know, or should know, that quite a number of chiefs broke ranks, although there was considerable political pressure for them not to break ranks. But for example, Chief Rick Hansen from the city of Calgary came to the committee, and he did not share Chief Blair's advocacy for the long gun registry. And I think if you ask chiefs generally in a world of finite resources where they have to choose between, for example, more boots on the ground or an ineffective long gun registry, they'll answer they want resources diverted elsewhere. If you just ask them straight out about the long gun registry, they'll probably give you a positive response. But if you ask them to rank it vis-a-vis other more effective resources, you'll get a very different response.
Time for a very short question and response. The honourable member for Ancaster, Dundas, Flamborough, Westdale.
Try to make it as short as I can, Mr. Speaker. I mentioned earlier that I was in the Public Accounts meeting when the Auditor General talked about the flawed nature of the data. Just want to ask the member, there's a perception that an officer actually inquires on the long gun registry every time, but it's actually a computer program, and there are a number of checks when they do a CPEC check. But what data can be relied on? Just want to ask the member if he knows about licensing and that data that's available all the time.
The honourable member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Yes, the honourable member raises a good point, and yes, the registration information is inherently unreliable, and it's searched thousands of times a day simply by a CPIC search when a motor vehicle is pulled over on a routine stop. The licensing information is much more accurate. Nothing in this bill changes the licensing regime. Individuals who want to purchase firearms or ammunition are still going to have a license, and that information is much more accurate and much more effective in the hands of law enforcement. I thank the honourable member for his question.
It being 1:30, the House will now proceed to the consideration of private members' business as listed on today's order paper. Orders of the day.
Members' business. Debate at